Yeah, it's interesting because the Sea of Galilee, as we'll see, it's not a standard sea as we imagine it. So it's interesting that those sudden storms can come up indeed. But tonight we are going to be continuing our uh, classes on the 8 signs of John. As our brother Paul has said, we're up to number 5 now. So we've looked at the water into wine, the healing the ruler's son, the healing of the lame man, and last week feeding the 5,000. And now we're on to this one, which is walking on water and calming the sea. Got our final 3 coming up: curing the blind man, the resurrecting the dead, the great haul of fishes. It's interesting to note the placement of these miracles, because of the miracles, 5 of them occur in and around the Galilee region, and 3 occur in around the Jerusalem region. That's interesting because of what those 2 regions perhaps represent. And we'll look at some ideas around that. So tonight we're going to look at Messiah Calms the Sea. And with all these talks that we've had of the 8 signs, there's been a primary problem, an application, or a reason why Jesus had to do the miracle. That might have been there was no wine, for example, or there was a man who was lame. So there's a primary application here, which is, of course, to still the storm. There was a great storm. The disciples were in trouble, and Jesus performed this miracle to still the storm. But with all the things that Jesus did, there was always a lesson he wanted his disciples to learn from this. And that includes us in many cases. So I think what I want to bring out tonight is perhaps what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples about with this sign, with this miracle. And the couple things that I've put down here, the couple lessons that I think are important: faith is required to withstand to the end of tribulation, and comfort is available to those who call. We'll also visit the idea of the kingdom is closer than you think. That's another sort of theme that I'll bring out through tonight as well. But there is also probably an underlying reason why Jesus did some of these miracles, an underlying reason that fits into more of the narrative of what God has in mind, a broader narrative. And in the subtext of this parable, of this miracle, we see something coming out which is all around the call of the Gentiles and the importance of that call to both Jew and to Gentile. So there's a sort of an undercurrent of those ideas, if you will. And I've expressed it, this is a little bit wordy, but is that the extension of the gospel to the Gentiles is the mode of eternal salvation of the Jews and the only way the troubled sea could be calmed. So that's encouraging the Jews, and particularly his disciples, to start to see that the Gentiles were essential in God's plan. We'll look at some ideas around Peter and the keys of the kingdom and convincing the disciples, as I say, of the call to the Gentiles. So Galilee, as we know it, it's the sea to the north of Israel. It's had an early name, which was Kinnereth, which means a harp. In the Greek, that is the Gennesaret, which is also meaning a harp. We imagine that's to do with the shape of the sea. It's referred as the Sea of Tiberias. Actually, in verse 1 of this chapter, that's where it is called. It's fed from Mount Hermon. It's a freshwater lake, and it's about 200 metres below sea level, making it the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, which is interesting. And I've picked this next picture of the region, probably a bit small, but what I wanted to show is the topography of it, in that it's really a basin, and there's lots of mountains right around it, and it sort of is, of course, below sea level. The places that are going to be relevant, and like to say that the map probably isn't very clear. I'm not sure, maybe can we get the light off, Greg? Might help a little. I know that the things are very tiny. The places that are fairly important in the story is Capernaum. A lot of things happen in Capernaum, and it's my belief that it's when they are making the journey, so Dave looked at the thing last week. And he said this is probably the area where the feeding the 5,000 were. It's likely that maybe the high mountain is somewhere here. We're not sure, but there's a reason why I think that this area of Gergesa is probably relevant. And the crossing probably was this sort of crossing across here. Now, the reason I say that is based on actually a couple of weeks ago, we reviewed the previous storm on Galilee, and it was actually the opposite journey from Capernaum to Gergesa that happened. And I think that this is probably a return journey where the storm happened as well. Of further note of this map, probably not much else. Capernaum, the name of Capernaum is city of comfort, Capernaum, and the Hebrew word naum is a comfort, and that'll come up a bit later as well. Galilee is known as Galilee of the nations. Come with me to Matthew 4. We'll have a look at this idea of Galilee of the nations. Like I say, broadening this idea around why Jesus wanted his disciples to understand how important the Gentiles were. And in Matthew 4, we read, beginning at verse 12, "Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled which is spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up." And this is a direct quotation from Isaiah 9. We're going to spend a bit of time looking at some of the verses in Isaiah particularly. Perhaps actually if we come to Isaiah 9, we'll get a good picture of this. But it's a section which is talking about the light affliction of this area initially. If we read from Isaiah 9, verse 1, we read about the idea it was lightly afflicted. Now, it's not entirely clear, but it seems like this is probably talking of this area of Galilee was actually one of the first captivities in the whole of the land of Israel. And that's recorded in 2 Kings 15, where Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, took Ijon and Abel-Maachah and Janoah and Kadesh, Hatzor, Gilead, and Galilee, and carried them captive to Assyria. And perhaps this event, being one of the earliest of captivities, was the reason why this became quite a Gentile area, because as the population moved out, then it created a bit of a void or a vacuum for other people to come in, and perhaps they settled there earlier on. And so in the time of Jesus, it was quite a cosmopolitan, multicultural area, Galilee. The word itself, Galilee, means a circuit. That's the word in the Hebrew. It's from the Hebrew galal, which is to roll, and therefore something which is circular. And in Strong's, it said that it came to be known as the heathen circle, or the idea of Galilee of the nations, that heathen circle. Filling the void was just in reference to what I just said. Just another translation of this chapter, just for interest's sake. It says, "Nevertheless, there'll be no more gloom for those who are in distress." And this idea of gloom or darkness is going to be something we're going to look at briefly. "In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honour Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan." As that doesn't necessarily come out in the verses, this idea of grievously afflicted is most translations say he will honour this area, Galilee of the nations. So the dimness, the darkness, this comes out several times in Isaiah, and I'm just wanting to pick up this idea of in darkness, and I'm going to we want you to turn to Isaiah 42, because we're going to look at Isaiah 42 a couple times tonight. And Isaiah 42, the quote that I want to bring out here is in verse 7. And just remember that in Matthew, it was talking about those who sat in darkness have seen great light. And in Isaiah 42, verse 7, we read this: to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners. That's once again another theme that's going to come out a lot tonight, from the prison, and then that sit in darkness out of the prison house. Okay. And Isaiah 42, also just over a few pages. We're going to come back to Isaiah 42. Don't bother to go into Isaiah 49 just yet. Once again, these references that thou may say to the prisoners, go forth. To them that are in darkness, show yourself. They shall feed in the ways, and their pastors shall be in all high places. So, Isaiah 58 mentions it as well. We'll sort of move on though. So is it walked or is it sat? Because in Luke, it talked about those who sat, but in Isaiah 9, it talked about those who walked. Now, in Matthew was what I meant to say, it said about that. But in Luke, it is also referred to by Zechariah to give light to them that sit in darkness and the shadow of death. And Matthew picks that up as well. Some people suggest it's because Matthew was sitting as a tax collector, and that's a reason. But I think what's actually going on is Zacharias and Matthew are picking up this theme from two places. Isaiah 42, as we've just read, that idea of those who sit in darkness out of the prison house. And another chapter, which we're going to come to a couple of times tonight, Psalm 107, just come to there briefly, because I want to just pick up some themes out of these ones. So Psalm 107, to pick up some themes and the particular section, Psalm 107 verses 9 to 10 is, interestingly enough, it references, he satisfieth the longing soul and filleth the hungry soul with goodness. And if we think back to last week, this is exactly where we came from. We came from those hungry people out in the wilderness, and they were fed, they were satisfied. But then as we come on to verse 10, such as sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, being bound, once again, this idea of the prisons, in affliction and iron. This idea is actually referenced through the whole chapter or the whole psalm, I should say, is about the continual mode of people who are in distress, and then they call to God and he delivers them out of their trouble. Particularly the theme is really about those who are in captivity. But if you flick your eyes over to verse 23 of the psalm, we read, they that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths, and are showing that sort of sense of swaying and being in this huge storm. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and that's the request to God, and he bringeth them out of their distresses. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still, and they are glad because they be quiet. So he bringeth them into their desired haven. So I believe that Matthew and Zacharias are picking up these ideas. And as we've also looked at just briefly, Isaiah 42 also had those same concepts brought out. But Isaiah also brings up in Isaiah 42, we've already read those words there, but if in Isaiah 42 there is surrounding text, which once again suggests this idea of those who are in shipping in the isles. So in Isaiah 42, verses 1 to 4, firstly talks about my servant whom I uphold. I've put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to who? To the Gentiles. And it says, he shall not cry nor lift up nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. And it says in verse 4, he shall not fail nor be discouraged till he have set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. And in verses 8 to 10, once again, it talks about those who are going down to the sea and all that is in there in the isles and the inhabitants thereof. So what does all this mean? Well, it's all picking up the idea that is a well-known idea in the scripture, that the sea is the type of the nations. And that sort of, when it says in Luke about the sea and the waves roaring, we know that means that the nations are in turmoil. And I think that's the sort of subtext of this miracle is that idea that there's this turmoil in the nations, and it's almost like Israel is sort of riding above that on the boat. But then there's the light to the Gentiles. Isaiah 42 verse 6 talks about that, and Isaiah 49 also references this idea of being a light to the Gentiles, and says to Israel in Isaiah 49 verse 6 that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. And the sense or the idea there seems to be almost like it's a vehicle of salvation, that they are like the vehicle that God will use to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And as far as that relationship goes between the Jew and the Gentile, perhaps I've just put this idea is that a boat needs the water. And we'll sort of revisit that idea a little bit later to have a look at what Jesus was trying to get into the disciples' heads, which is a seismic shift in their understanding, which is that the Gentiles are essential to God's plan. Okay, some background events. So coming back out of that sort of brief foray into these ideas around the Gentiles and the Sea of Galilee and what that all means, come with me to Matthew 10, because we're going to just look at where did Jesus come from with his thoughts. As our brother Paul said in his prayer, the reason we're here is to know Jesus, or that's and to know God. And let's try and understand, where was Jesus coming from? So Matthew 10, these are the background events leading up to the miracle that Jesus performed. Firstly, in Matthew 10, verse 5 to 6, if we just look at that, Jesus sends his disciples, sends away the 12, 2 by 2, not to the Gentiles, he says, but to the lost sheep of Israel. And that's in Matthew 10, verse 5 to 6. And he instructs them to go out and preach and to heal the sick and cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils, and perform these signs. As we flick over to chapter 11, we come to a section which details John the Baptist out. And here was John. He was in prison under Herod, and he sent his disciples to Jesus, and Jesus says to them, well, look, you just need to show them what I'm doing here, that the blind receive their sight in verse 5, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And then he goes on to upbraid the entitled nation of Israel. And he starts to talk to them as being, well, he refers to them in verse 16 as children sitting in a marketplace and basically saying, we've played you music, why haven't you danced? You should dance to our tune. And that's sort of the idea of them being entitled, is really reflecting the ideas in Isaiah 5, which is the idea about the vineyard that God set up. And in that vineyard, he set up everything perfect for the Israelites, but it brought forth wild grapes. And this is the sort of the ideas that Jesus is really tapping into, because he then continues to say, woe to thee in verses 21, which is in that Isaiah 5 section. Woe unto thee, Chorazin and Bethsaida! If the mighty works were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. And he also even says that that Sodom would have repented. It would remain until this day. And he's saying so much has been given to you as Jews, but you have in many ways rejected that. And it's almost like he's starting to sort of show, well, we need to start to turn our attention to the Gentiles. As we continue on, the healing of the withered hand, he actually quotes from Isaiah 42, which we've already read a bit. Isaiah 58 to 59 references the idea of God's stretched out hand. And then we come to Matthew 12, verse 38 to 41, and he talks about the Pharisees ask him for a sign. And he says, well, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. There shall be no sign be given, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now, it's particularly interesting in our talk tonight because, of course, we understand Jonah was in that very situation. A sea which was raging and in turmoil, and it talks in their language about the sailors rowing hard, and he was thrown overboard, and then there was this calmness that came about it. And it says, the men of Nineveh in verse 41 shall rise up in judgment with this generation, referencing back to what he just talked about, the idea of repenting in sackcloth and ashes like the men of Nineveh. And then we come to where we are at tonight. The death of John the Baptist, and he sought comfort in solitude, and then the feeding of 5,000, which we covered last week. So I'm trying to get the sense of where was Jesus' mind at and what was he trying to do with his disciples. And all through this is this theme of there's this transfer, this idea that the entitled nation of Israel, they were looking for something, and it wasn't exactly what, they were looking for a Messiah who would deliver them from the Gentiles, basically. But they hadn't realized that actually that Messiah wasn't going to be another Judas Maccabeus figure that would be, a revolutionary who would do that for violence. He had a different plan. He had a different idea, and it was to bring the Gentiles in together. So immediately following, they come to the miracle of the calming of the sea. They come to Capernaum, and the Jews begin to reject him because of his hard sayings. We read that following on in John. And then he heads out to Tyre and Sidon, where he talked about the people of Tyre and Sidon, and he heals the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman. And it's no mistake that she uses this idea of this bread to the dogs, because that was exactly the idea. He'd given all this bread to the Jews, and they'd been like, well, give us more of this bread. But she's saying, just a few crumbs, that's all I want. This is the difference between an entitled nation and a nation that truly desires God's word. And then we go down into Decapolis, which was a largely Gentile area. And in Matthew 15, verse 31, it says, the people of that place glorified the God of Israel, showing it was a Gentile land. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000, which is regarded as being a Gentile feeding. And then finally, Peter's declaration, Christ blessing to Simon Bar-Jonah. So I've been trying to develop these ideas, and hopefully you're sort of staying with the sense of it about where I'm going with this. But we're going to now start to look at the actual miracle itself. We're going to draw out a few lessons from that. So just a map of the area again. Don't know why I had that one in there. So the miracle itself of the calming of the sea. It's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. It's not recorded in Luke. And they each not agree on certain things. They each say certain things, all of them together. And then there's a few extra points added in each of the particular ones. So I've highlighted the colours. Hopefully you can see the colours as to what happens. So the first event is the people seek to make Jesus the king. John's the one that records this one in John 6 that we read today. And there's a link back there to perhaps to the temptation, because there was the Satan, the adversary, was to make him king, and took him up to a high mountain. And in this case, it's the opposite, because Jesus sends away the 12, and then he goes up into a high mountain alone to pray. And that word alone is very much it's repeated in every single record, and it shows perhaps the state of mind and position that Jesus was at. He really was alone, because largely his disciples didn't understand him. His people, the Jews, he knew only wanted him for the bread, for the miracles, and so he departs into this high mountain alone to pray. It then records that the ship went that of the disciples, which were sent away to Capernaum. Ship was in the middle of the sea. John records it was dark, and that the wind arose, was contrary. Matthew records the ship was tossed with waves. Mark records the disciples toiled in rowing. And John gives us this length, about 25 to 30 furlongs, or as we read had read tonight, 3 to 4 miles is a close approximation. We're going to look at this idea of the word stadia, which is the furlongs here, about 4.5 to 5.5 k's in metric. And around the fourth watch, 6 a.m., the disciples look, as I believe, to the east, because I feel that they were on that they were on that east coast before they went across. And the disciples look and see Jesus walking nigh unto them, but Mark records he would have passed them by. It's a very interesting idea that he wasn't coming to them. He wasn't actually coming to the disciples. He was, it seems, going to Capernaum, continuing on the course that he had. And the disciples cry out in fear. They think it's a spirit. They don't see it as being Jesus to begin with. And then Jesus responds, "Don't be afraid, it is I." Then there's a section which is only recorded by Matthew, which is the bit about Peter. And so Peter asks if he can come to the Lord from the boat. And Jesus says that he can. So Peter walks on water initially, and then he sees the wind boisterous and fear creeps in, and he calls for salvation, and Jesus stretches out his hand and pulls Peter up and declares unto him, "Thou of little faith." Jesus enters the boat. John records they willingly received because they were really fearful for their lives at this point. And then the wind stops, everything becomes calm, and John says that they were immediately at Capernaum. And so they were from the middle of the lake, they were suddenly at Capernaum. And the disciples are, of course, sore amazed, and they worship Jesus as truly the Son of God. But Mark records they did not consider the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. So that's the miracle with a few surrounding elements to it, which are recorded in the Gospels. Now, just a few sort of perhaps practical thoughts or ideas that might come out of this. I've picked a couple. The first is what I've called the trial of our faith. Now, the disciples were sent away, and they were sent to Capernaum. As we know that means the city of comfort. This is where Jesus was saying, you go ahead to Capernaum, and I'll meet you back there. And but they never reached their destination initially because the storm comes up, and the language is one of a despairing, hard, difficult situation. It was in the middle of the sea, it was dark, they were tossed with waves, the wind was contrary, they were toiling and rowing. It was a hard slog that they were going through, and they were in fear of their lives. That is obvious because how they cry out to Jesus and how willingly they receive him into the boat. And so this is, I believe, telling us about our discipleship, about our walk to the kingdom. Because we'll look at this a bit later on in the thing that I've entitled, the kingdom is closer than you think. But the idea here is that this is about a trial. This is about a difficulty which we actually probably can't cope with, really. And that's the idea here. The disciples in this particular case, they couldn't cope with it. This word toiling, it's an interesting word where it talks about them toiling and rowing, and it's mentioned only in Matthew and Mark. The Greek word is basaniso. It's usually actually translated torment. It's only used 6 times in the gospel and only about 3 events. So the first usage of it is in Capernaum, where the centurion's servant was in torment. And that's where he says to Jesus, don't come under my house, I'm not worthy for that. You just say the word and he'll be healed, right? That's the first thing. And then the other two are in Matthew and Mark, and they're only about two other events, and we're going to look at those ones briefly. But the word itself has an interesting idea of testing metals by a touchstone, which was known as basanite, which was a black siliceous stone. Essentially, what you'd do is you'd take a piece of gold that you would know the value of or the purity of, and you'd rub it across this black stone. And then you'd take something you didn't know and you'd rub it across the same stone and see whether or not it matched, right? So it was a test. It was the idea usually of it being torment, testing by torture almost is the idea. And the idea of it is coming from the idea of base and, the getting to the bottom of it. And we use that phrase ourselves. Let's get to the bottom of this. And I think the sense really is God saying, well, what's at the bottom for you? Like when it all comes down to it, who are you really? And that's the sort of the real idea that comes out of this. The interesting thing about this is that there are two times it's mentioned, like I say, which is the healing of Legion and this event of the calming of the sea, the second calming of the sea. They just come when they come across to Legion. They've just come from another great storm that Jesus calmed. And they came across to this land, and here was Legion, and he says in Matthew 8, art thou come hither to torment us before the time? And that's our word here. But in Matthew, again, the word was the ship was in the midst of the sea, and the ship itself was tormented by the waves. So that's just an interesting sort of idea that the ship was tormented by the waves. Mark, once again, this is the only other references in the Gospels, is the Legion. I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. And this word toiling in rowing. And he saw them toiling, tormented by rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. So what does this say? Well, of course, there's some obvious things that come from it. Like I said, the idea here is God testing, trying, and understanding what is in our hearts, essentially. And there are many quotes which we can look at for this, but Malachi 3, of course, is a classic. He shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, shall purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver. And this idea that that's the test, that's the touchstone, that's the thing that God is trying to do. And of course, the where we take our title of the slide from in 1 Peter verse 1, and perhaps Peter imagined this word or this idea when he was writing these words. He says that the trial of your faith being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honour and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. So that's really one of the ideas that comes out of this parable, is this idea of who are you really? When it comes to the bottom of it, when it comes to scraping, getting to the very base of things, what is your level of purity, and what happens when we scratch you across that stone? So the next thing, as I've said before, the kingdom is closer than you think. This one is based around the word, like I said, about that word furlong, which is the Greek word stadia. It's 600 Greek feet, approximately 185 meters. And it's obviously that word stadia has a reason behind it. It's the length of a race, a stadium in Greek competition. Got the Olympics coming up, so we'll all be cued in on that. But 25 to 30 stadia, 4.8 to 6.4 kilometers, sorry. I think I had a different figure for the last thing, but that's okay. 3 to 4 miles. And there are only 6 mentions of it in the New Testament, of this word stadia. Of course, there's a unit of length. And so the first ones we have here are the ones in John 6 that we've looked at. We've got one here in John 11, That's actually surrounding the sign of the healing of Lazarus. Bethany was about 15 furlongs off. There's a couple in Revelation. And we're going to look at Revelation 21, actually. It's going to come up at the end of our class. The first one is about the Revelation 14, but perhaps Revelation 21 is a better reference, that this new Jerusalem coming down out of the clouds, 12,000 of these stadia, about 2,200 kilometres. So it's probably figurative in that sense, but that is a reference in Revelation 21. And also, interestingly, the two on the road to Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem, about 60 furlongs. Interesting note that it's all divisible by 15. I'm not sure what we can take from that, except for the wine press. That one's not. Someone might have some ideas about that. But this road to Emmaus also has the same phrase that we looked at before, as if he had his face to go further. Jesus made to go further, but they say, no, come in, abide with us. And it's sort of a very similar idea to the inviting in of the disciples, come into our boat and save us, essentially. And so all of this idea I'm trying to develop here of the kingdom is closer than you think. There's a length of time, right? But there's an uncertain length of time in this particular case. It's 25 or it's 30, we're not sure. And the sense of it is that we're waiting for the kingdom. We can't wait for it to come, but how long? How long are we going to have to wait? And a couple quotes which I think are interesting in this regard is Psalm 69 is one, which is a plea in a time of trouble. And this is someone who is in mire, sinking there. He's asking to be delivered from those that hate me out of the deep waters. And let not the water flood overflow me, neither let the deep swallow me up. But he asks God in an acceptable time for your salvation. And Isaiah 49, we've referenced Isaiah 49 a couple of times, says these words, "Thus says the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee. In the day of salvation have I helped thee. I'll preserve thee, give a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritage, that thou mayest say to the prisoners, go forth, to them that are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall feed in the ways, and pastors shall be in the high places." And that another translation says, "This is what the Lord says, at just the right time I will respond to you." And that's the idea. When is the kingdom? And we can't wait, and we're desperately needing it. At just the right time I'll respond to you is what God says about that. And this idea really comes in with the ideas of John, because there's this sense of they didn't feel they could go any further, the disciples. They didn't feel they could row. The sense is that they were really in desperate need. And it says that they received Jesus and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. And that's why I'm saying this idea, the kingdom is closer than you think. That's the idea. And it won't matter then. The length of time won't matter then, because immediately they'll be in Capernaum. They'll be in the city of comfort where Jesus has said that he would go to. Psalm 107, we've already read these words, but the bits we want to pick up are the bits at the end there. Then they glad because they be quiet, the waves and the sea is quiet. So he bringeth them unto their desired haven, where they want to be, where they truly desire to be. That's where God will bring us to. There's one more reference for this stadia, which I didn't mention because I just thought we'd just leave it to the end, which is in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24. "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receive the prize? So run that ye may obtain." That word race is actually that length, the stadia, the length that we've looked at. Okay, we're going to head into a little bit here. It's an area where I've read through a lot of things, but I don't think I've fully understood, the details. There's probably not a lot of time to go through what I was thinking of saying here. So we're just going to try and conclude through some thoughts here. So the word I've talked about, the Capernaum, the city of comfort. I just wanted to introduce the idea of this word Nahum or Nahum, probably. Properly is to sigh, to breathe strongly, and it's an interesting word in the Hebrew because it can mean both the idea of where it says God repented him, for example, in the times of Noah. God repented him from making man, and it's sort of like that's the sort of idea of it, right? Whereas it can also be like, so that's the sort of idea of it. It can also either mean comfort or the idea of being, repenting for what you've done. The time Noah is actually very interesting because it says about Noah that he was named Noah, which is the idea is rest, his name. And his father said that because he will comfort us, he will nahum us, he will be this comfort to us. I don't have time to go into it, but there's references there about Noah and about, of course, the waves and the sea, and even about the dove, which we sort of have briefly referenced, but there's interesting things around Peter being sent from the boat, Peter being the son of Jonah, Jonah meaning the dove. There's a lot of linking there, which we don't really have time to go into. But I just wanted to conclude with a few thoughts here. Like I've said, I believe that this parable is about our expectations of the kingdom and our desire for that to come. And like I said, the trial of our faith that leads us to the point where we will be purified, where we will find ourselves in that place. And we've looked at Isaiah 42 several times, and I just want to pick up a couple thoughts which run through there. Isaiah 42 is this idea. It says, "Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare." And it says, "Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the ends of the earth. Ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof." Now, these quotes make us or encourage us to think of quotes in Revelation. So we've talked a lot about the sea and the waves roaring and what that means, and how what this means as far as the kingdom is concerned. And there will be a time, of course, when that will be no longer the case. Revelation 15 talks about the sea of glass mingled with fire. And this idea is that that's the calmness suddenly come over the nations. And during the 1,000-year reign, that will be the time. There'll be a calm that will come. And there will still be nations, but there'll be a calm. And what are they doing? They're singing. They're singing, like in Isaiah 42, it talked about singing. The song of Moses, the servant of God. And there's one final quote, which I believe is a bit of a nexus point for all the quotes we've looked at. Turn to it because it's Isaiah 54, because it brings out many of these ideas that we've considered tonight, and links it into the kingdom age, as it were. So Isaiah 54, I've got it up here on the screen, but it's Isaiah 54. And if we pick up ideas in verse 5. It talks about thy maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, the God of the whole earth shall he be called. And in verse 9, we've got this reference. This is as the waters of Noah unto me. And basically the idea is it's a really short period of time in the grand scheme of things. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee nor rebuke thee. And there's a promise there. But in verse 11 is where we want to really pick up our ideas. O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, and not comforted. That's that word, nahum, not comforted. But my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord, that hath mercy on thee. Sorry, I just completely jumped between two verses. Let's read verse 11, which is where I was actually reading from. Thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, not comforted. Behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colours, and lay thy foundations with sapphires. And of course, this makes us think of that quote. We've already been to Revelation 21. But the former things are passed away. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away in Revelation 21. There was, in this case, no more sea. That time is gone. And John sees the holy city. And it talks about it as a bride adorned for her husband. Picking up those themes in Isaiah 54. And tabernacle of God being with men. And finally, we're there with dwelling with Jesus. And they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And it talks about no sorrow, crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. It is a time of comfort. We're finally there. And this quote talks about the New Jerusalem coming down, by measure. It's a number of study. But with the city was pure gold like unto clear glass. It's actually this very similar word to the sea of glass, which is mentioned in Revelation 5 and verse 15 and 5 and chapter 15 as well. And the foundations of the wall were garnished with all manner of precious stones. First foundation, jasper. The second, sapphire, like we've just read about in Isaiah 54. The third, a chalcedony. The fourth, an emerald. And then it continues down. So the sign that we've considered tonight, it's a sign that has a lot of really interesting things, and I probably haven't really brought out the sort of linkings with the ideas of the coming together of Jew and Gentile and what that meant for the disciples. But it does encourage us to continue on, because we are in a situation where we feel day by day that we are rowing pretty hard, that we don't feel like we can really do much more. But what that's all about is God trying to get to the bottom of us, trying to understand who we are in our deepest level of character. And he's trying to refine us to the point that we can then be able to finally get to our city of comfort and to be there with Jesus forever.